Welcome back to the deep dive. Today, we're doing something a little bit different. Usually we take a topic you might know just a tiny bit about, and we try to fill in the gaps for you. But today we are taking on an absolute mountain. We are tackling a name that is, it's literally a synonym for genius.
Yeah, it really is the heavy hitter of heavy hitters. I mean, if you ask a 5-year-old to draw a scientist, they're going to draw this exact guy. Yeah. You know, the crazy hair, the mustache, maybe sticking his tongue out.
Exactly. We are talking about Albert Einstein, but here is the problem with figures like Einstein. They become memes, they become t-shirts. You see E equals MC squared on a mug, and everyone just nods like they know exactly what it means, but do we? Do we actually know the guy?
That is the real danger of being an icon, honestly. The humanity just gets completely stripped away. You cease to be a person, and you just become a symbol.
Right. So our mission today, and this is guided by a really fascinating biography from Famous People Bio, is to deconstruct that meme. We want to find the actual human being underneath the wild hair and the complex math. And let me tell you, the source material we are pulling from today is wild. It is not just a story of a smart guy doing math. It's a story of failure. It's a story of being a refugee.
It is a profound story of resilience. And I think that is the main thread we are going to pull on today.
Absolutely. I mean, we are going to talk about a time when Albert Einstein, of all people, could not get a job to save his life. We are going to dig into his miracle year, which sounds like a movie title, but it actually happened. And we are going to get into some of the much darker stuff, too. The political persecution, the assassination list.
That part always chills me when I read it.
Yeah, the source actually mentions a specific bounty on his head, $5,000, which, you know, might not sound like a massive fortune right now, but back then, that was huge.
It was life-changing money for whoever could claim it.
And we will even get to why he turned down the chance to be the president of a country. I mean, his whole life is just one massive what if after another. So let's stop looking at the dorm room poster and let's start looking at the man. Where does this story actually begin?
Well, if we are going by the Famous People Bio source, we really have to ground ourselves in a very specific time and place. We are starting in the Kingdom of Württemberg.
Which sounds like something straight out of a fantasy novel. The Kingdom of Württemberg.
It really does sound made up, but it was a very real part of the German Empire. And the date is March 14th, 1879. That is when Albert is born.
Okay, so late 19th century, we are talking horse-drawn carriages, early steam engines, men walking around in top hats.
Exactly. It's a very different world. And the source notes right away that he is born into a Jewish family. His father is Hermann Einstein, and his mother is Pauline Koch.
I actually want to pause on the parents for a quick second, because usually when you have a Mozart-level genius like this, you look at the parents and you kind of expect, I don't know, university professors, concert pianists. But the source describes his dad, Hermann, as a scientific utility salesman.
And an electrician.
A scientific utility salesman. That is such a highly specific, slightly weird job title to us today. What does that actually mean in the context of 1879?
It's a brilliant little detail, isn't it?
Yeah.
You have to think about the era. This is the very dawn of the electrical age. Cities are just barely starting to think about electric streetlights. Factories are just beginning to electrify. So scientific utilities likely meant the actual hardware driving this massive revolution.
Like what specifically?
Things like dynamos, copper coils, early electrochemical equipment.
So he is basically selling the shovels during the gold rush. But the gold in this case is electricity.
Precisely. And if you imagine what that does to a household environment, Albert isn't growing up in a quiet house full of dusty philosophy books. He is likely growing up in a house completely cluttered with gadgets. Copper wire, magnets, voltmeters everywhere.
That makes so much sense when you think about his later life. He sees the physical stuff before he ever really understands the high-level math. He gets a tactile, hands-on feel for how invisible forces like magnetism and electricity actually move physical objects.
It totally grounds him. A lot of theoretical physicists can get completely lost in the abstraction, but Einstein always had this really deep intuition about how the physical world actually worked. And I heavily suspect that watching his dad try to sell these gadgets, having to explain how they work to layperson customers, played a huge role in developing that intuition.
And then there is his mom, Pauline. The biography says she was housekeeper.
Which, in that specific era and class, was essentially a full-time management position. Running a household, managing the domestic economy. It provided the baseline stability. You have the dad out there hustling in this brand new volatile tech market, and the mom keeping the entire ship afloat at home.
But the ship didn't actually stay in one port for very long. The source tracks their movement pretty closely. In 1880, when Albert is basically just a baby, they moved to Munich.
Right, a much bigger city. They were likely chasing better markets for that electrical business. Munich was becoming a real hub.
But they don't just stay in Germany. And this is a beat in the story that I didn't really fully appreciate until I read this source. In 1894, when Albert is 15 years old, the entire family packs up and moves to Italy.
To Milan, specifically at first. And then a bit later, they moved to Pavia.
Italy. I mean, just think about the stark contrast there. You are a teenager. You have grown up in Munich, which is very orderly, very traditional German, maybe a bit gray and industrial at that time. And suddenly, at age 15, you are dropped into Milan.
The light is completely different.
Yes. The food is different. The entire culture is different.
It is a total sensory explosion. And for a developing mind like his, that kind of geographic and cultural dislocation is incredibly powerful. It forces you to see the world from an entirely new angle. You start to realize that the rigid rules of your home country aren't the rules of the universe. They are just local customs.
That is a really great point. It breaks the mold of how you think. But before we get him fully settled in Italy, we do have to talk about his school days in Germany. Because the source is very specific about his education, and it frankly busts a pretty big myth that you and I have probably both heard.
You mean the Einstein failed math myth?
Yes. Everybody loves that myth. People always say, oh, I failed my algebra test. But it's fine because Einstein failed math too.
It is a very comforting lie that we tell ourselves. But the source text makes it crystal clear that was absolutely not the case. It states he started his education at a Catholic elementary school in Munich at age 5.
Which is an interesting detail in itself, a Jewish boy being sent to a Catholic school. It shows the family was somewhat integrated, or at least highly pragmatic about where to send him to get a decent early education.
And then, when he turns 8, he transfers to what the source calls the Louisville Gymnasium.
Which I assume is a slight translation quirk in the source text we are using.
Yes, it is almost certainly referring to the Luitpold Gymnasium in Munich.
Right.
But the key word for you to pay attention to there is Gymnasium. In the German educational system, that is the strict academic fast track.
Right.
It is exactly where you send the kids who are destined for university. You do not send a struggling kid to the gymnasium. It is rigorous. It involves Greek, Latin, and high-level math.
So he was on the officially recognized smart kid track from day one. He was not failing math. But here is the detail in the biography that really blew my mind. It says at age 12, literally 12 years old, he taught himself algebra and Euclidean geometry.
Taught himself. That is the exact phrase we need to underline here.
I am genuinely trying to picture this. I have a 12-year-old nephew. Getting him to just do his basic assigned homework is a massive negotiation involving snacks and taking away screen time. And Einstein is just there, presumably sitting in his room, voluntarily cracking open a complex geometry textbook.
And not just casually reading it. Euclidean geometry is all about proofs. It is pure logic. It is taking a very small set of basic axioms and building an entire flawless universe out of them. For a 12-year-old to find comfort in that, it tells us something profound about his personality.
What do you think it tells us?
I think it tells us that he deeply craved order. The real world is messy, people are confusing and unpredictable, but geometry is perfect. If A equals B and B equals C, then A must equal C. There's absolutely no ambiguity. I think for a young, highly observant Einstein, that level of certainty was almost a spiritual experience.
It was a refuge from the chaos.
Exactly. And the fact that he went out and did it entirely on his own strongly implies he wasn't getting what his brain needed from his formal schooling. The school was probably heavily focused on rote memorization, just repeat after me. But Einstein wanted to know why things worked, so he went home and just figured it out himself.
That fierce independence seems to be his absolute defining trait. He doesn't wait around for anyone's permission to learn.
No, he doesn't. And that specific attitude serves him incredibly well later in his scientific career, but actually causes him a massive amount of trouble in the short term.
Which brings us to the next major section of the source material. I like to call this part the reality check. Because he eventually graduates, everyone knows he's brilliant, he has taught himself all this advanced geometry, and then he hits a massive brick wall.
The struggle phase. This is the part of the biography that I honestly think is most critical for people to hear today.
The source is remarkably blunt about it. It says, and I quote, Einstein spent 2 years in search of a teaching job, but didn't find.
2 full years. Just let that sit with you for a moment.
That is a really long time to be unemployed.
It is an absolute eternity when you are 21 or 22 years old. You have the fancy degree. You think you are completely ready to conquer the world. And the professional world just looks at you and says, no thanks.
But why couldn't he get a job? I mean, with his intellect, was he just terrible at interviewing?
It really goes back to that fierce independence we just talked about. When he was in university, Einstein was, well, let's say he was arrogant. He routinely skipped classes he didn't find interesting. He openly argued with his professors. He completely refused to play the academic game.
Ah, I see. So he was that guy. He was the, well, actually guy sitting in the back of the lecture hall.
Exactly. And in the world of 1900s European academia, you desperately needed your professor's glowing recommendation to get any kind of teaching job. His professors probably looked at him and thought, this kid is undeniably smart, but he is a massive pain in the neck. So they just flat out didn't recommend him.
So he is essentially blackballed from the industry who trained for.
Essentially, yes. He is sending out letters, he is applying for all these positions, and he is just getting total silence back. Imagine the psychological toll that takes. His father's electrical business wasn't doing very well at this time either. He probably felt like a huge financial burden on his family. And he is sitting there watching all his less brilliant friends easily get jobs.
It is the ultimate failure to launch scenario. And honestly, it is incredibly relatable. You do everything you're supposed to do, you get the grades, you pass the exams, and then you step out into the real world and nothing.
It deeply humanizes him. He wasn't just magically floating toward greatness on a cloud. He was fighting for basic survival.
So how does he actually break out of this slump? The source says he finally lands a job, but it is not at a university like he wanted. It is at the Federal Office for Intellectual Property.
This famous patent office located in Bern.
Right. And his official title, Assistant Examiner.
Literally the absolute bottom of the professional totem pole.
It sounds so agonizingly boring, Assistant Examiner. It sounds like the exact place that big dreams go to die. But the biography actually suggests this might have been the greatest thing that could have possibly happened to him.
I would strongly argue it was completely essential to his development. Look at it this way. If he had actually gotten what he wanted and become a junior university professor, he would have been instantly crushed under the academic weight of publish or perish.
Right. He'd be stressed out all the time.
He would have had to write safe, boring papers on topics his boss approved of. He would have been spending all his evenings grading hundreds of freshman physics exams.
He would have just become another cog in the machine.
Exactly. But at the patent office, he had a strict 9-to-5 schedule, and he was really good at the work. He could look at a submitted invention, like a new type of gear system, or a novel electrical switch, and his brain could instantly see if it would actually function. He finished his required work incredibly quickly.
And then what did he do with the rest of his day?
And then he had time. He had vast amounts of mental space. Nobody was watching him over his shoulder. Nobody cared what he was thinking about in his downtime. He could just let his mind wander all the way to the very edges of the universe while physically sitting at his boring wooden desk in Bern.
Plus, the job itself, having to look at these specific patents, it constantly forced him to visualize things. How does this machine work? How do the moving parts relate to each other in space and time? That is highly practical physics.
Exactly. It completely kept his feet grounded in the real physical world while his head was up in the stars.
Now, during this exact same time, this patent office era, his personal life is really ramping up too. The source mentions he gets married in January of 1903 to Mileva Merrick,
who was a brilliant fellow physicist, by the way.
Yeah.
A highly intelligent woman in her own right.
And they quickly start a family. The source lists their children for us: Liesel, Hans Albert, and Edward.
So try to picture the actual scene here. It is 1904, 1905. He is a very young dad. There are diapers, cloth napkins in those days, scattered everywhere. The baby is crying in the middle of the night. He still has to wake up and go to the office to check patents on, like gravel sorters. He is constantly worried about money.
It is a totally chaotic, completely normal life. He is not living like some isolated monk in an ivory tower.
Not at all. And amidst all that intense daily chaos, the crying baby, the tedious day job, the financial stress, he somehow manages to finish his PhD. The source notes that he completed his thesis, which was titled A New Determination of Molecular Dimensions in 1905, earning his degree from the University of Zurich.
Which brings us perfectly to the absolute main event of his life, the miracle year. The source describes it as an explosion of output. In the single year, he produces 4 groundbreaking papers. And I really, really want to dig into these with you. Because the source lists them, but I feel like we as a society just sort of glaze over the titles. We say, oh, relativity, cool. But we need to understand why these 4 specific papers were such a monumental deal. Why is it universally called a miracle?
It is called a miracle because any one of these 4 papers would have been a massive, career-defining achievement for a normal, brilliant scientist. To produce all 4 of them in a single calendar year while actively working a completely unrelated full-time day job, it defies logic. It is statistically impossible.
Okay, let's walk through them one by one based on the source list. The first one is the photoelectric effect.
Right.
Now, to me, hearing that term just sounds like how a modern solar panel works.
That is exactly what it is. The principle is the same. But the scientific implication at the time was incredibly radical. Back then, absolutely everyone in the scientific community thought light was exclusively a wave, like a continuous ripple moving across a pond. It flows smoothly. But Einstein looked at the experimental data and said, no. Sometimes light acts more like a bullet, a distinct particle.
A bullet?
Yes. He called these distinct packets quanta. We know them as photons today. He argued that light is delivered in little, indivisible packets of energy. And if you hit a piece of metal with these high-energy packets, you can physically knock electrons loose from the metal. That is the photoelectric effect.
So he basically just invented the foundation of quantum mechanics right there.
He absolutely kicked the door wide open for it, yes. He proved that nature at its core is pixelated, in a way. It is not a smooth, continuous flow. It is made of discrete chunks.
Okay, wow. So paper 1, nature is pixelated. Next up on the sources list, Brownian motion.
This one might actually be my favorite underdog story of the bunch.
It sounds like a terrible digestion problem, honestly.
It does sound weird. It actually refers to a biologist named Robert Brown. Many years before Einstein, Brown was looking at tiny pollen grains suspended in water under a microscope. And he saw them just jittering around, constantly dancing and zigzagging.
And nobody at the time knew why they were doing that.
People had all sorts of wild theories. Some thought maybe the pollen was somehow alive, or maybe it's just tiny heat currents in the water. But Einstein sat down and did the brutal math. He said, look, imagine the water isn't smooth, but is actually made of billions of tiny, invisible balls atoms.
Wait, hold on. Are you saying people didn't believe in atoms in 1905?
A surprisingly large portion of the scientific establishment didn't. They thought atoms were just a convenient mathematical fiction for chemists to use, but not actual physical, tangible objects. Einstein showed through rigorous statistics that the only possible way the pollen could jitter in that exact random pattern is if it was being violently bombarded by millions of invisible collisions from real physical atoms in the water.
So he basically used the random jitter of a tiny speck of pollen to undeniably prove the physical existence of the atom.
Exactly. He made the invisible atomic world visible through pure statistical math.
That is literal Sherlock Holmes level deduction.
And it really is. It settled a massive scientific debate almost overnight.
Okay, so paper 2. Atoms are undeniably real. Done. Now we arrive at the third one, the really big one, the special theory of relativity.
This is the one where he completely breaks human reality.
Please break this down for us. What was the old reality that everyone believed before this paper?
The old reality was completely defined by Isaac Newton. Newton basically said that time and space are a fixed stage. The stage is entirely rigid. A second is a second no matter where you are in the universe. A meter is a meter. It totally doesn't matter what the actors on the stage are doing. The stage itself never, ever changes.
Which sounds completely reasonable to me. My watch ticks at the exact same speed as your watch.
Right, it aligns with our daily common sense. But Einstein came along and said no. He said the stage is not rigid at all. He argued mathematically that space and time are actually fluid, and they completely depend on how fast you are moving through them.
So if I start moving really, really fast,
your personal time actually slows down relative to someone who is just standing still watching you.
That is the part that just completely melts your brain.
It melted the entire physics community's brain. He realized through his thought experiments that the only thing in the entire universe that is absolutely constant is the speed of light. Everything else, your experience of time, your measurement of physical distance, literally squishes and stretches to ensure that the speed of light remains constant for everyone.
So he is basically standing up and saying, everything your common sense tells you about reality is wrong. The universe is deeply weird.
Exactly. He took the absolute stage of Newton and replaced it with a deeply relative human experience.
Paper 3. Time is relative. Check. And finally, we get to the fourth paper. The source simply calls it the equivalence of matter and energy.
which of course gives us arguably the most famous mathematical equation in human history.
E equals mc squared.
Let's just interpret that equation for a second. E stands for energy. M stands for mass. And C represents the speed of light. He's explicitly saying that mass solid physical stuff like a rock or a chair or a sandwich is actually just incredibly tightly concentrated energy.
So it's like energy that has been frozen into a physical form.
Yes. And because c, the speed of light, is a massive number, and in the equation you square it, it means that even a microscopic amount of mass contains a truly terrifying amount of locked up energy.
That is essentially the secret code of the universe right there. It explains exactly how the sun shines. It explains how nuclear power plants work.
And very tragically, it explains the destructive power of the atomic bomb. It is all contained right there in that one simple little elegant equation.
So let's just quickly recap this miracle year, 1905. He proves light is a particle. He proves atoms physically exist. He proves time is relative to your speed. And he discovers that all physical mass is just frozen energy.
All while actively working his full-time day job as an assistant examiner at the Swiss Patent Office.
It honestly makes you wonder what everyone else was doing with their weekends. I think I watched 2 entire seasons of a reality show last weekend, and Einstein just quietly rewrote the fundamental laws of physics.
It is deeply humbling, to say the least.
The source explicitly says that these 4 papers brought him instantly to the limelight.
Well, the word instantly there is maybe a bit relative, much like time itself. It actually took a few years for the broader scientific community to truly read, digest, and understand what had just happened. But once they finally did, the professional floodgates just completely opened for him.
And this perfectly moves us into the rise to fame section of the source material. The biography tracks his upward climb. By 1908, he is officially appointed as a lecturer at the University of Bern.
So he finally gets that elusive teaching job he desperately wanted years ago.
But he certainly doesn't stay put for long. He finally quits the patent office and becomes a physics docent at the University of Zurich. And then shortly after, in 1911, he becomes a full-time professor at Karl Ferdinand University in Prague.
He is a completely hot commodity at this point. Major universities are actively bidding for him to join their faculties.
And the high-level accolades just start piling up. In 1916, he is appointed president of the German Physical Society. He even attains full membership in the Prussian Academy of Sciences.
Which, you have to understand, is the absolute top of the academic mountain. Berlin was the undisputed center of the global scientific world at that time. To be inducted into the Prussian Academy was basically to be recognized as a living god with scientists.
And in these stories, there is always but as his professional career completely skyrockets, his personal life crashes hard. The source is pretty direct about tracing this. It explicitly mentions the separation.
Yes, he and Mileva separated in 1914.
Just think about the timing of that. 1914, World War I is just starting to rip Europe apart. He moves to Berlin for his prestigious new role. Mileva takes the kids and moves all the way back to Zurich.
It must have been an incredibly lonely time for him. Or perhaps he found it liberating, depending entirely on how you look at their dynamic. But the core family unit was completely shattered.
The divorce is officially finalized on February 14th, 1919, literally Valentine's Day.
That is a remarkably brutal historical detail.
And then the source notes that he remarries less than 4 months later. On June 2nd, 1919, he marries a woman named Elsa Lowenthal,
who was notably his cousin.
Yeah, the source lists her name, and if you just dig a tiny bit deeper into the historical record, you find out she was actually his first cousin on his mother's side and his second cousin on his father's side.
It was a practice that was not entirely uncommon in European royalty or certain upper-class circles back then, but it certainly adds a thick layer of messy complexity to the saintly image we have of him. He was not a perfect monk. He was a very messy, complicated human being.
He wasn't perfect at all. He was deeply flawed personally, but professionally. He is about to transcend from being a famous scientist to being an absolute global icon. The next section of the source material is titled The Global Celebrity, and this is where the entire narrative shifts.
It really kicks into high gear in 1919, just after the war ends. A famous British eclipse expedition went out and actually proved his theory of relativity was physically correct. They observed that the gravity of the sun literally bent the starlight passing by it.
And the newspaper headlines the next day were completely insane. Things like, Lights all askew in the heavens, men of science more or less agog.
Overnight, he is the man who successfully overthrew Isaac Newton. He is universally crowned as the smartest man alive.
The source mentions a very specific invitation that really highlights this crazy new fame. He was officially invited by the mayor of New York on April 10, 1921.
Just try to imagine that specific scene. He arrives in America by ocean liner. There are thousands and thousands of normal people waiting at the docks just to see him. Reporters shouting questions, flashbulbs popping, cheering crowds.
For a theoretical physicist,
It's absurd. Can you imagine that happening today? A mathematician causing a literal traffic jam in downtown Manhattan.
absolutely no way. Maybe a massive pop star, maybe a championship athlete, but a guy who just does complicated math. Why were the masses so incredibly obsessed with him?
I really think the entire world was deeply traumatized. World War I had just ended. It was this senseless, mechanized, brutal slaughter. Millions of young men dead. Western civilization felt totally broken and pointless. And then here comes this guy with wild hair and kind eyes who says, I have figured out the hidden machinery of the universe. It is strange, but it has beautiful rules. There is order up there.
He represented something much higher than human politics, something pure.
Exactly. He was a shining symbol of human intellectual potential in a time when human behavior looked incredibly ugly.
The source then lists out his world tour. He didn't just stop in New York and go home. He traveled to Singapore, he traveled to Japan.
The source text also strangely mentions a place called Ceylon.
Ceylon. Yeah, I stared at that for a solid minute trying to figure out where that was.
I am almost positive the source text has a typo there. It is certainly referring to Ceylon, which is modern-day Sri Lanka. It was a very major stop on the British steamship routes heading to Asia at the time.
That makes perfect sense. So you have to picture Einstein, the brilliant European physicist, touring the deep tropics.
It is a really wonderful historical image. And his reception in Japan, the crowds that came out to see him in Japan were absolutely enormous. They treated him exactly like he was a visiting emperor.
He was the very first truly global scientific superstar. The source says he delivered massive lectures at Columbia University, at Princeton University. It notes he briefly moved to Washington, D.C. He was quite literally everywhere.
And he was actively using that massive platform. He wasn't just standing up there talking about theoretical physics anymore. He was talking about global peace. He was talking about Zionism and human rights. He was becoming a very prominent public intellectual.
But as the saying goes, the higher you climb, the much bigger the target on your back becomes. And this brings us to the very dark turn in the source material.
The devastating rise of the Nazi Party in Germany.
The entire tone of the biography completely shifts right here. We go straight from these joyful ticker tape parades in New York to literal death threats on the streets of Berlin.
The source explicitly mentions a new law that was set in Germany.
This was the law for the restoration of the professional civil service, which is an incredibly boring, bureaucratic name for a truly horrific policy.
It strictly forbade Jewish people from holding any official government or state positions. And in Germany, that explicitly included all university teaching roles. So virtually overnight, Einstein, the single most famous and accomplished scientist in German history, was fired from his post.
But it was not just about losing his job. The source gets really, really dark here. It says he himself was on a list of assassination targets by the Nazis.
A literal hit list.
And this specific detail, I really had to read it twice to make sure I saw it right. The source states there was a $5,000 bounty placed on his head.
Let's contextualize that amount of money for the listeners. $5,000 in 1933, that is the price of a very nice house. That is several years' worth of salary for an average working man in Depression-era Germany.
That is absolute life-changing money for any random thug on the streets of Berlin.
It effectively put a massive flashing target on his back for absolutely anyone who wanted to make a quick fortune by killing him.
But why? Why did they hate him so intensely? He is just a physicist. He is not a military general. He is not a rival politician. Why put a huge bounty on the relativity guy?
Because he represented absolutely everything the Nazi ideology violently hated. He was Jewish, obviously, which was their primary target, but he was also a very vocal pacifist. He was a dedicated internationalist, meaning he didn't believe in the concept of Germany above all else. He believed in his shared global humanity.
And what about his actual science? Did they attack that too?
They absolutely attacked his science. They actively labeled it Jewish science. They hated relativity because it was highly abstract and deeply theoretical. The Nazis pushed for what they called Aryan physics, which was supposed to be purely experimental, concrete, and deeply rooted in the German soil. They literally tried to ban the teaching of relativity in universities because they deemed it too Jewish.
That is just terrifying to think about. The idea that pure science can become completely political, that an equation like E equals mc squared could be declared wrong just because of the ethnic background of the person who discovered it.
It clearly shows exactly how dangerous totalitarianism really is. It doesn't just want to control people, it actively tries to rewrite physical reality itself.
So Einstein clearly realizes he is not safe at all. He has to run. The source traces his desperate route to find refuge.
He was actually traveling in the United States when Hitler officially took full power, which is likely the only thing that saved his life. He immediately knew he could never go back.
The source notes that he found temporary shelter in England first.
There are some really incredible historical accounts of him living quietly in the English countryside, being actively guarded around the clock by local men carrying shotguns because the threat of that bounty was so real.
Are you serious? Guarded by locals with shotguns?
Yes. He is a heavily hunted man.
But he eventually decides he needs to cross the Atlantic for good. The source says he made the final decision to stay permanently in the United States.
He safely lands at the newly formed Institute for Advanced Study located in Princeton, New Jersey.
And then in 1940, the source clearly notes, he officially applies for and gains his permanent U.S. citizenship.
Just try to imagine that specific moment for him. He is standing there in a courtroom, taking the oath of allegiance. He has completely lost his homeland. His life's work and his books are literally being thrown into bonfires in the streets of Berlin. Many of his close colleagues are desperately fleeing or being thrown into camps. And he is in his 60s, having to start his entire life over in New Jersey.
It creates a very, very different mental picture of the old Einstein. You know, we always picture the harmless, eccentric grandpa figure wandering around the Princeton campus in baggy sweaters. We forget he wasn't just a peaceful retiree. He was a traumatized refugee.
He was a permanent exile. He never set foot on German soil ever again for the rest of his life. He simply couldn't forgive the nation for what they willingly did.
Yet, despite all this massive personal tragedy, the rest of the world just kept trying to honor his genius. The source lists out several major awards, and we definitely have to talk about the Nobel Prize.
Yes, the Nobel is a fascinating story in itself.
The source clarifies a specific timeline that I think confuses a lot of casual fans. It notes he received the Nobel Prize in Physics in 1921, which is the exact same year he visited New York. But, and this is the crazy part, it wasn't awarded for relativity.
No, it wasn't. It was officially awarded for his discovery of the photoelectric effect.
Why in the world would they do that? Relativity was the massive reality-breaking idea that made him globally famous.
Well, the truth is, relativity was still viewed as far too controversial by the old guard. The Nobel Committee was incredibly conservative. They weren't 100% sure the math on relativity wouldn't eventually be disproven. But the photoelectric effect, that was grounded in solid, undeniable experimental proof. So they officially gave it to him for that, and then they added a vague little note in the citation saying, and for other contributions to theoretical physics, which was basically a very quiet nod to relativity.
A little bureaucratic hedge.
Yeah.
Just in case the whole bending space and time stuff turns out to be entirely bogus, we didn't give you the medal for that.
Exactly. They were covering their institutional bases.
The source also mentions a few other honors. In 1929, he was presented with the Max Planck Medal of the German Physical Society in Berlin. And this is a really cool detail, the naming honors. The actual chemical element Einsteinium was named directly for him.
Element 99 on the periodic table.
That has to be the absolute ultimate form of human immortality. Famous presidents maybe get an airport named after them. Einstein got a fundamental building block of the physical universe named after him.
It is entirely fitting for what he accomplished.
And the source also mentions that a stadium was named for him, which I personally find incredibly hilarious.
I don't think he was exactly known for his dynamic athletic prowess. I mean, he really liked sailing, but he was famously terrible at it. He couldn't even swim.
Wait, Albert Einstein couldn't swim?
No, not at all. He would just happily drift around on a small sailboat, deeply lost in thought about unified field theory physics, and he was constantly getting stranded on sandbars and needing to be physically towed back to shore by the locals.
That is such a great mental image. The smartest man on the planet constantly needing a tow from a local teenager.
But speaking of massive honors, there is one specific story in the source that really caps off his legacy for me. The Israel proposition.
This part is just mind-blowing. The source plainly says that in his later years, he was formally offered the position of president of Israel.
This happened in 1952, right after their very first president, Chaim Weizmann, passed away. Israel was a very brand new, highly vulnerable state. And the leadership essentially turns to Einstein and says, please come lead our country.
Just imagine getting that phone call at your house in Princeton. Hello, Albert.
Yeah.
How do you feel about running an entire nation?
It is completely unique in modern history. Has any other theoretical scientist ever been asked to become the head of state of a nation? I really don't think so.
It shows the immense moral weight his name carried globally. He wasn't just viewed as a scientist anymore. He was viewed as a modern, wise prophet.
But he immediately said no.
He did, and I absolutely love the reason he gave. The source quotes his reasoning. He stated that he felt he had neither the aptitude nor the experience to deal with human beings.
Neither the aptitude nor the experience. It is such a profoundly humble and honest admission.
It is the ultimate display of self-awareness.
It really is. He deeply understood that mastering the predictable mathematical laws of physics is completely different from mastering the messy, emotional laws of human politics. Physics is purely logical. People are deeply irrational. Einstein knew he was a once-in-a-generation genius at the first one and completely terrible at the second one.
He didn't let his own massive ego trick him into taking the job. A lesser man would have easily said, well, I am universally recognized as the smartest man in the world, so of course I can figure out how to be president.
But he didn't fall for that trap. He stayed strictly in his lane. And by doing that, he permanently preserved his moral integrity. He remained an independent, trusted voice for peace until the very end.
So he safely stays in Princeton. He continues his daily walks. He continues to work on his physics. He spends his later years obsessively trying to find a unified field theory, which, spoiler alert, he never quite cracks.
Right, he spent the last few decades of his life desperately trying to mathematically combine gravity and electromagnetism into one single, elegant equation. He completely failed.
The smartest man alive failed.
He did. He died with a notepad next to his bed, full of complex equations that simply didn't work out.
Which brings us to the very end of his timeline. The source states he passed away at Princeton, New Jersey on April 18th, 1955.
At the age of 76.
The source wraps up with a really beautiful quote attributed to him. It says, "A person who never made a mistake, never tried anything new."
It is an absolutely perfect summary of his entire existence.
It really is, because when you step back and look at the entire sweep of the source material we covered today, his life was completely full of what society would call mistakes.
The mistake of aggressively clashing with his university teachers, the mistake of flatly refusing to network for a proper academic job, the tragic mistake of his failed first marriage.
But if he hadn't made all of those specific mistakes, if he had just been a perfectly good student and a highly compliant employee,
he would have almost certainly ended up as a perfectly mediocre physics professor at some mid-tier German university. He would have been too busy grading papers to think about the speed of light. We would have absolutely never heard of him.
The massive struggle is exactly what created the necessary space for the genius to emerge.
Precisely. The painful rejection gave him the quiet job at the patent office. The patent office gave him the mental freedom, and that freedom gave all of humanity the theory of relativity.
So here's the final provocative thought I want to leave you with to all of you listening right now. We started this deep dive asking the question, where does a true genius come from? And looking at Albert Einstein's life, the surprising answer seems to be massive rejection.
Rejection paired with relentless curiosity.
If you were sitting there right now listening to this and you're feeling totally stuck in life, maybe you didn't get that dream job you applied for. Maybe you are currently working a boring, dead-end job that feels entirely beneath your potential. Just remember, Albert.
He sat at a wooden desk in a quiet office in Bern for 7 long years.
And he used that exact time to fundamentally change how the entire human race understands the universe. So don't let the word no stop your internal drive. That painful no might just be the exact detour you need to find your own breakthrough.
Very well said.
I think that is a solid wrap on Einstein for today. A massive thank you to the famous People Biosource for providing the incredible roadmap for this conversation.
It was a truly great journey through a fascinating life.
And a huge thank you to you for sticking with us and listening. We will catch you on the next deep dive. Keep exploring.
Goodbye, everyone.
Wait, hold on. I actually can't let you go just yet. I have one more thing.
Oh, what is it?
I'm looking down at my notes on the miracle year again. We talked about all the heavy science in the 4 papers, but I feel like we slightly missed the raw personality of what he actually did there.
How do you mean?
Well, the source just lists these very dry academic titles. Brownian motion. The photoelectric effect. But think about the sheer audacity of this guy. He was 26 years old.
26. He was a complete nobody in the field.
He wasn't a tenured professor. He didn't even have his official PhD until the very end of that year. He was essentially an amateur enthusiast doing physics in his spare time. And there are historical records showing he wrote a casual letter to a friend saying, basically, I'm going to publish 4 papers that will change everything.
He absolutely knew what he was holding.
He knew he was dropping an intellectual atomic bomb on the establishment. There's this fascinating cocktail of deep intellectual humility and absolute staggering arrogance that I just find so compelling. The source really hints at it early on with the detail about him teaching herself geometry.
It is the unshakable confidence of someone who has actually sat down and done the grueling work. He didn't need an older professor to pat him on the head and tell him he was right. The pure mathematics told him he was right.
That is the ultimate takeaway for me. Trust the math. Trust your own internal logic. Even if the entire established world is yelling at you that time is absolute, if your careful math says time is relative, trust the math.
Yeah, it is a very dangerous lesson to live by, but an undeniably powerful one.
Dangerous if you happen to be wrong. Brilliant if you happen to be Albert Einstein.
Fair point. Very fair point.
Okay, one final tiny thing on that Ceylon mystery from the source text.
The likely Ceylon typo.
Yeah. I actually quickly looked it up on a map while you were talking earlier. It is an island. A beautiful teardrop shape sitting right off the coast of India.
Right. Modern day Sri Lanka.
Just imagine that long boat ride for him.
Yeah.
Weeks and weeks stuck at sea, no internet, no phone, constantly buzzing. Just the massive open ocean and his own thoughts.
And a notebook. He absolutely always carried a notebook.
Do you honestly think he was intensely working on high-level physics while on that boat? Or was he maybe just relaxing and looking at the waves?
I genuinely think for a mind like his, just looking at the waves rolling by was working on physics. He probably saw the complex fluid dynamics and gravity equations right there in the moving water.
It must be nice to have a brain like that. I look at the ocean and I just see water.
That is exactly why he is Albert Einstein, and we are just 2 people sitting here analyzing him.
Ouch. Completely true, but ouch.
All in good fun, I promise.
All right, now we are really done. Thanks so much for hanging out with us today.
Farewell, everyone.